Good afternoon, Medical Alley. Again, my name is Shay Mandel. I'm President and CEO of the Medical Alley Association, and we are thrilled to have with us today the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Paul Gazelka from NISWA. This is our town hall session recap, and so we're going to spend time with Senator Gazelka, and later in the program, we'll be joined by the House Majority Leader, Ryan Winkler. For all of those of you online attending, I want to remind you to please use the Ask a Question function. We will have question and answer as time allows at the end. So on the Q&A, please submit your questions, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible. So I want to introduce Senator Gazelka, give him an opportunity to say hello, give everyone an overview, and then we'll do some questions. Senator Gazelka, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be with everybody. I didn't even know what Zoom was about 6 months ago, and so it's been a major transition. We had first ever votes and activity via Zoom, and not everybody on the floor and not everybody there in committee. So really just trying to navigate to a new place. We had plans of a bonding bill with some tax relief. And a few other things. Healthcare reform was one of the things we were working on. And suddenly COVID hit, and it was like we dropped everything and then tried to figure out how do we get up and running. And actually pretty proud of the legislative body, both House and Senate, trying to work together, trying to focus on COVID, work with the governor. The emergency powers was a new twist. I don't think, certainly in my lifetime, it's never been more than just a few days, and we're moving into months, and so that's created its own friction as well. But then we immediately worked together on a lot of resources for COVID, well over $500 million. House and Senate almost unanimously agreed to get into the governor's hand to buy things that we needed, PPE and whatever else we needed to be ready for a likely potential surge, which we still think will come in July. And I'm hoping that we've set ourselves up to be successful, and now we're actually trying to open up the economy, and I'm pushing faster than the governor wants because I believe I understand the consequences of waiting too long, and he's balancing, rightly so, going too soon and what that does to the number of people getting infected too soon. It's never been about stopping the virus. It's been simply about managing it and controlling it so that we don't have too many people in the hospital at one time where we can't actually take care of people. So a huge balancing act. I'm trying to give as much grace as I can. But once we got going, then we moved back towards getting the bonding bill done and the tax bill. You guys can ask me questions and I'll give you my reasons, but it didn't get done. That's the short version. But I'm still committed to that. So now special session or emergency powers, if we get to June 12th, the governor has to call us back in special session if he wants to extend them. And you probably are all aware that I cannot end them by myself. I probably would at this point. It takes both the Senate and the House to both agree, or it continues until both agree it doesn't. So that's the place we're at. And so we'll be back June 12th. And at that point, I believe the four legislative leaders will either agree what's in it or we won't do it. So bonding bill, tax bill, I think some business grants, 60 million or so of business grants, and a few other things, but not many things. And last thing I'll mention too is the longer the emergency powers have gone, the more friction I think it's created. The governor approved the state worker contract raises this July when we were passionately opposed to that. We supported last July's increase, but not this July. So that went forward without us. Then some of his rulings on what can be open coming forward, and rather what's not open, has created frustration. And finally, we believe that emergency powers only grant the governor misdemeanor penalties, but the Attorney General has launched into $25,000 fine per offense and gross misdemeanor, which is up to a year in jail. And so there is growing friction, and yet I'm trying to work on the things that really are important for Minnesota. Throw in there an election year, and it just is there's all kinds of danger that we have to navigate around.
Well, I think everybody uses the term unprecedented, right? I think we're all tired of it. But certainly in the political arena, unprecedented issues, as you mentioned, emergency powers, not being able to meet with your colleagues face to face in a way that you normally would. So we definitely want to talk about special session and the bonding bill. But you've mentioned some friction. How has just working from home and the magnitude of that, your inability to be in hearing rooms as you normally would, how have just the circumstances impacted opportunities for bipartisanship?
Well, in some ways, it pushed us to bipartisanship because we had to filter out a lot of the things that just weren't going to go anywhere. That certainly was the beginning. We passed a number of things that all four leaders agreed on. But then you do have your passionate issues either side of the aisle that you're trying to promote. So those kind of happen there. But I think the negative side of it, especially as we came to the very end of special session, is we were down there at the Capitol, but we were in 6 different rooms. And then a number of people were at home. If they were over 70, many of those age 70, many of those people didn't come there. But the lobbyists weren't around. The public was not around. So there wasn't the psychological pressure that I think is certainly always there and wasn't there. And so that probably had a factor as well. But certainly my family is tired of me doing Zoom meetings at the kitchen table or in the bedroom or out on the deck. I know we sold our house on Gull Lake, and now we're actually in East Gull Lake, and we're renting, but I now know that the house we have that we're going to buy in the future is going to have a place where I can do this stuff, because I never even thought about that a few months ago.
Yeah. So before we get back to the real issues of the day, since you mentioned being at home, so what is the one new habit or ritual that you've picked up during the quarantine being at home?
Eating too much food. That's what it is. Yeah. I mean, Zoom is probably the big one that I really have become, it's been just a major important part of every day that I'm doing now, which is great. But on the negative side, I definitely eat more than I want and don't exercise enough.
I think that's true of all Minnesotans and Americans at this point. So the bonding bill. So there's still there's quite a distance between positions on the bonding bill. You made the comment, we'll do these things or we won't. Tell us what's going to happen. You think there's going to get a deal done, and what do you think will be included?
Yeah, well, what I'll say is Speaker Hortman and I pretty much agreed on a bonding bill and tax bill. So that's the leader of the House and the leader of the Senate. But unique to most other things is it takes a supermajority. So that means the minority in the House and the minority in the Senate both have a bigger voice than what's normal. So I think you can expect a bonding bill to be in the range of 1.1 to 1.35 GO, general obligation bonds. And then I'm going to advocate for a good number, 300-400 million for highway bonds, focusing on roads and bridges, and then there'll be some other factors in there. And then the bonding bill itself, I think will have an emphasis on wastewater infrastructure, HEAPR, which is your higher education. If in the bill that we had on the Senate floor, it was just under $1 billion. It had $85 million for the University of Minnesota and $85 million for Minnesota State. So if the number is above that, then those numbers likely would go up as well. So we just want to focus on the things that really affect the whole state, or at least regional. I'm not sorry about that. I don't know what that was, but blanked out.
Yeah, it's part of the fun of technology, right? And again,
yeah, somebody trying to, yeah.
And again, for those of you watching today, want to encourage you again, if you do have questions, to use the question and answer function on Zoom, and we will be happy to ask your questions. Going forward, there is an election, obviously. Good.
Well, it's somebody trying to contact me. I'm on my iPad. I apologize. I left my laptop at the Capitol, but we'll we'll just get around it. If I have to, I'll take it and give me a 5-minute pause if I have to. But I know
No
who it is.
problem. No problem. Well, we do have an election this year. And so, as every year when you get to election time, there's always some really amazing work that you want voters to know about. And, they always seem to be things that are underreported or unknown. So during the last 10 weeks, what is something that, you'd like Minnesotans and voters to know that's happened during this that, hasn't really been reported widely?
That's going to be a problem. But unfortunately, they're going to keep it's that a national show that's trying to get a hold of me. But what I will say is the fact I think the governor, myself, and the speaker actually worked really well together. I mean, we are very different from each other with ideology, but we all recognize that COVID was a major problem and that we needed to focus on that moving forward. And so, that, because you hear about the friction, and there is friction, but we have a lot of conversations privately, respectful. We push each other when we disagree. That's part of the deal, but it's not vindictive. It never was personal, and so particularly us three, that's been very, very productive.
Well, this healthcare has always been critical to Minnesotans, and as you know, one of our largest industries with about 500,000 people working in healthcare, and those are the sectors of the economy that are part of Medical Alley. What would you like to see our industry doing to be supportive of this recovery and delivering better healthcare going forward?
Well, the role that you play, Medical Alley plays. I apologize. I'm trying to text the guy. Don't call me for 30 minutes.
All good.
So,
No
but
worries.
the Medical Alley, I think the fact that it is a broad swath of healthcare groups coming together, building consensus, and then bringing that to us at the legislature is really important. I know that you're perceived on both sides of the aisle as very, very important and a very strong voice. And so that's the part you have to do. And so this next session, we're going to have a big budget shortfall. I just don't know how big. That's going to be what we're wrestling with. And so what are the things that we must not give up? And I got to tell you, every lobbyist, every group has what they won't give up. But really thinking through that. And then number two, what is it that is going to reignite our economy? We, the government, have taken unprecedented measures, more than I thought we ever should have, but that's a whole nother issue. But now that we are where we are, what is it that we need to reignite the economy? And so you guys are going to have an important voice, particularly for Minnesota, about what we can do.
We're certainly very pleased as the opening up of what was originally termed non-essential surgeries, as people that were suffering from disease before COVID-19 didn't stop, and so we've been very pleased and appreciate the support on being able to get healthcare back to all of those people who are affected by a lot of other issues besides COVID-19. So you have had obviously great experience as a leader in normal times, and now are a leader in this generational crisis, which is, of course, why you're getting pinged from a national show to go to tonight. So for you, thinking about normal times to now, I mean, what was the biggest change in terms of being a leader in this time? And, how did you deal with, that kind of additional pressure?
Well, it's tremendous pressure, and there is when people are afraid, when people are irritated, when people are disrupted, um, the desires aren't always noble or angelic, and so trying to keep the pot from boiling, I think, has become critical. And so that's what I've tried to navigate too. Um, and at the same time, um, meekness is not weakness. Meekness is basically strength under or power, or strength under control. So I've been trying to tell our folks, yes, there is a place that we need to disagree, and sometimes forcefully, but it shouldn't be unnecessary. There has to be a definite reason. It can't be vindictive. And so in this pressure cooker, there's a lot of those feelings going on. House, Senate, governor. There's been some pretty interesting conversations behind closed doors that I'll leave behind closed doors, but
Yeah.
based on the pressure that everybody's dealing with. And so my wife would like me to show more emotion at times, but for what I'm doing right now, it's really important to be cool.
Yep. Well, and we appreciate that. You definitely cool under pressure, and that is what we need. One of the questions wanted to ask you about how you're thinking about liability reform, as especially providers, but a lot of businesses, not just in healthcare, very concerned about new liability issues that can arise from COVID and taking quick action. Wanted to see what you were thinking about in terms of liability reform.
Well, very supportive. We have, unfortunately, that's a hot button issue year after year. And so there are some forces that want to take this crisis to move forward with things that are kind of the opposite direction of where we want to go. And so I don't know that we're going to get anything done here. I'm very, very supportive. I'm not sure the House or the governor will be supportive. And so if you find openness from the House or the governor, let me know. That could be a role that you all play, because it is a factor, and there could be a lot more lawsuits all over the place as a result of how we've done this. And so I'm very sympathetic. We actually worked through legislation, but we have not found a willing partner with the majority in the House. You could ask Representative Winkler about that. The trial attorneys had their own version that we didn't think looked too good. So just saying.
No, and we appreciate that support. I mean, it's definitely in an unprecedented time where you've got organizations, obviously, focusing on the thing that matters most. Inevitably there are going to be issues that arise, and so that's been an important issue. Again, thinking about the election, so normally after session, the caucuses would have fundraisers, and clearly that's not going to happen for a while. So you look forward to the election. I mean, what are your plans for caucus fundraisers? What are you telling your candidates about campaigning? What can we expect the campaign landscape to look like between now and the election?
Well, the Senate can raise money even if we're in a special session. The House can't. I guess they have some different rules than we do. And I am still raising money. It's just a little more difficult to do it. And we will have some sort of meetings where lobbyists will participate. We haven't worked out that because we're sort of waiting on the governor and what might happen in mid-June or later. But this election is very, very important. Divided government with the players that are in the majority has worked for Minnesota. If I'm not there, you can expect massive tax increases. I'll just tell you that, because we're going to have a big shortfall next year, and that will be the direction that they would go. If we had a surplus and they wanted $12 billion of tax increases over 4 years, then you can expect something more than that, frankly. And so So it's a big deal. Senate Republicans, that's what I'm focused on. We're in better shape than we've ever been. We've raised more money than we ever have. And I started 4 years ago thinking about right now. And so, but the election and how we campaign, nobody really knows for sure. I mean, what is it going to be like to knock on doors? Is that going to be a negative or a positive? I don't think there's going to be parades. So all of the large gatherings, I think many of them are not going to happen this summer. So that tells me that incumbents are probably better off than challengers as a whole. But it's again, COVID's going to make this election unique. Trump can't come to Minnesota and have 20,000 raving fans. I mean, so there's just, I don't know how it's all going to play out. It's just very, very unique. But I do know it's important that Republicans keep the Senate.
So now that you have a little bit of hindsight, and we're still certainly in the middle of all of this, but you all have been making quick decisions in real time with the information available. So as you look back on decisions that were made in March or even early April, are there decisions that you would make differently or encourage the governor to make differently?
Yeah, the biggest one was, I remember his first decision to shelter in place everyone. And I really felt, and I told him then privately, I disagreed, that I thought that we should be sheltering in place seniors and vulnerable. I just felt like that was the group. I didn't know that his own data from the University of Minnesota and modeling showed that the results were basically the same, whether you sheltered in place seniors and vulnerable or sheltered in place everybody. It had produced the same scenarios for number of deaths, same scenario for number of beds needed, and so that was the big one where we differed. I tried to publicly be as supportive as I could, because in the end, once a decision's made, you got to roll with it. But that was probably the biggest divide right there. I felt like science showed that you could take different paths on this, but in the end, if we're not working together, this is a world problem, and in Minnesota we have our own task related to this. But that's the good news about the relationship that I have with the governor is we do talk a lot, and when I disagree, he knows it. It's not a secret to him, and I think because of that, I think he gets to a better place. And just one story I think I can share. I push him about open the economy because I know the price of waiting is going to be far greater than just people's pocketbooks. But he said, well, are you talking to people on the front lines? And when that question had been asked to me, I really hadn't. And so because we had a good relationship, he was challenging me on the other side of it. So I called folks that work at HCMC, and I called somebody that was on the front lines in New Jersey, and I called a nursing home. And I think that's the benefit of that, the fact that we work to the same solution, as we can listen to each other, and I think in the end you get a better product. So anyway, I thought that worth sharing.
I think it's a great story, and thank you for sharing that. I think people like to see politicians working together, but also saying, yeah, you know what, you're right, I didn't have that conversation, help me have it. So as you think about the policy side, so what do we need to do? What do we need to do now to better prepare for a potential second wave or fall wave?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, the making sure that we have all the things available, PPE, beds, we already have, if it's worst case scenario and we have a need for a morgue, we have that, and we have the tests. The test is really a compliment to Minnesota companies, and that Medical Alley. I mean, that's really cool that we are on the front line of that. But making sure that that is all in place. Let's say the surge is in July. That doesn't mean it ends. I mean, I think this is 18 months or longer. So that's making sure that we keep advancing in those directions. But the more we can open up business and control hot spots at the same time, the more successful we're going to be. It's such a balancing act. It's acknowledging that we're going to go through this, and then acknowledging that businesses have to stay open or we're in trouble. And so So those are the key factors that we all have to make sure we have the supplies. In private conversations, the key is, that did we save every life that could have been saved? And that's the question. In other words, if we overran our hospitals and people died because we weren't prepared, that's where I feel like we would have failed. But if people get sick with the virus, that is part of herd immunity and people going through a pandemic. And so it's a fine line, and we all have to be compassionate as we're making really tough decisions.
And I don't think there's anybody out there that would like to be making any of these decisions. So again, a lot of pressure on you. Really appreciate the leadership. So do you think the federal government has done a good job enough to help the states during this crisis, or are you hopeful that there will be more federal aid coming to Minnesota?
Well, they talk about more federal aid coming to Minnesota. I'm concerned that the federal government be careful with the amount of debt that they've added over this already. So I'm not the expert there, but I have talked to some of our Congress people about that, and they think that more money is coming. So that the federal government in the beginning, I think Trump in particular, I thought, the fact that he closed travel to China right away against people's advice was a good first move. And then there's been some good steps and missteps along the way, just like probably every governor as well. But I am glad that they've let states be states, and that we see some states have opened up more than others, and we can watch to see, well, what is effective, what's not effective, and learn from each other. And so in that regard, I'm glad that states have more say in how we're doing it. But beyond that, I'm not the expert either, and so we're just going to have to wait and see what they decide to do with more resources.
And as you're watching other states, again, lots of different approaches. Are there any states in particular you're watching or that think are doing a particularly good job that Minnesota can learn some lessons from?
Well, I'm watching the states that are opening up quicker, to see the results, like Georgia. I have a good friend high up in Texas that I talked to about, one of the things they did that I thought Minnesota should do is they did more regional openings. So, and they let, frankly, the big cities decide whether they were going to do shelter in place or not. So they gave more flexibility more regionally. I thought that was a good idea, and I think still could be a good idea in Minnesota. So we're not New York City. I mean, we don't have the people condensed into much tighter spaces. That we don't have the same use of commuter rail and buses that they do, and so that's going to have a much different footprint than Minneapolis, St. Paul, or the rest of the state. So trying to find states that are similar to us and see what they're doing. And I'm looking to other countries. Early on, I thought that Sweden was taking the right approach. People mocked at first, but I don't think they're mocking Sweden now. And so it was that really encouraging your people to practice the safe distance and all the CDC guidelines that we have here, but trying to keep things as open as possible because of the economic side of it. So all of us are going to look back a year or two from now and really decide what is the best way to handle a pandemic. I'm just glad that this wasn't like the movie Contagion, which I finally watched. I couldn't believe it was all taking place in Minnesota, but it wasn't 25 to 35% mortality. That would be a much different scenario.
So now that we are easing many restrictions here in Minnesota, what are the things personally that you're looking forward to this summer?
I love a lot of activities around Gull Lake. So, going to Zorba's and Grandview and all of the things that can be enjoyed out in the public. I love eating out, and so we're going to be able to do some of that. Those are kind of simple things. I get to golf anyway, so that one's fine. But it's all the activities around a lake that I care about.
Fantastic.
Oh, my wife yelled in the background, "Church," which is absolutely true. We've been doing Zoom. Some of the bigger churches in Minneapolis, St. Paul have, we watch that. But I am looking forward to getting together with other like-minded folks.
Fantastic. Well, I think as you can see, Senator, we have been joined by House Majority Leader Ryan Winkler. Ryan, how are you? Welcome.
Thanks, I'm well. How are you?
Very good. So for our audience, again, House Majority Leader Ryan Winkler from Golden Valley. And Representative, we've been chatting through the session wrap up with Senator Gazelka, getting some insights on special session, bonding. And so I'd love to, we'll give you the floor to talk a little bit and then have a bunch of questions. Senator Gazelka, you are welcome to stay, but also free to go and take care of some of those other things if you'd like to.
I got that problem I got to fix. So anyway, thank you everybody for being on, and we'll talk to you again sometime soon.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. Ryan, the floor is yours. Give us your perspective on the session as it's been, COVID-19. You've got a broad audience of Medical Alley members who are really interested to get your perspective and ask you some questions.
Okay, well, great. First and foremost, I would love to hear your perspective on what's happening in the economy, what you're seeing in your businesses, what's happening in the med tech and medical and healthcare space generally. Obviously, certain parts of it are very much in the news, and I'm very much aware of issues related to procurement and some of the hot items that we need to be able to manufacture in rapid order and to provide for healthcare providers and for the state as a reserve. But there hasn't been much discussion of other things other than, I've talked to doctors, I've talked to hospitals, I know a little bit about their challenges, but not the rest of the healthcare economy. So I'd like to hear more about that. When we started this session, there was a relatively light load. The goal was to pass a bonding bill to help with a backlog of infrastructure needs. We needed to make some policy changes. There were some, including you, had a desire for some tax provisions. And it was a relatively easy session. And a lot of politics leading up to an election for positioning purposes was going to be part of it. Obviously, COVID-19 in the middle of the session changed that entirely. There was a period of time where the legislature, between the two parties and between the House and Senate, worked quite well together to provide $400 million in funding for the governor and for healthcare institutions to be able to get going on getting the PPE and ventilators and other equipment they needed, expand ICU capacity, et cetera, et cetera. And so we worked quite well for a period of time. And the governor's peacetime emergency was pretty broadly supported. Then, maybe in the last 3-4 weeks of session, some of the backlash to the economic impact of COVID-19 in certain sectors started to fuse into a bit of a partisan response, and we saw a bit more of a divide form on issues related to COVID-19 and the proper response. And that led ultimately to a legislative session ending with more questions than answers, I think, on the issues that we started on. No tax bill, no bonding bill, significant questions about the use of federal funds, a budget that went into deficit, and obviously a pandemic whose course we don't really know and has a significant and devastating economic consequence, which then undermines our confidence in our budget and our ability to predict where funds are going to be available under existing revenue and expenditures that we have in law. So, we have this more or less automatic June 12th special session coming up as the governor extends his peacetime emergency. And at the end of the legislative session, I think the combination of uncertainty and partisanship related to the governor's course of action on the pandemic response, combined with uncertainty about finances and the knowledge that a special session was coming to have the session end sort of in a fizzle, we did succeed in passing several important bills related to education policy and finances, healthcare policy, and so forth. But it was all kind of below the radar normal functioning of state government kind of work that we were able to move through none of the signature items. So we have about 3 weeks from tomorrow before the June 12th special session. We don't know if we're going to be able to come to agreement between the House and the Senate and between the Democrats and Republicans in each body with the administration on, bonding, taxes, how to spend the federal funds, and how to address the state deficit, plus how to provide some basic economic security for a lot of individuals, small businesses, and families that are hit really hard by this. So it's unknown at this point whether we will be able to strike a deal. If we do strike a deal, I think a special session would be short. If we don't, I think it's anybody's guess how the June 12th special session will run and how long it will last. So really a lot more questions than answers.
Well, I pushed Senator Gazelka on this, so I'll go ahead and push you to at least to pull out the crystal ball. And he did say, when we come back, we'll do it or we won't. But he seemed, I won't say confident, but encouraged that there will be a bonding bill. Parties seem to be quite a distance apart. What do you think? You think people will be able to come together and get a deal done?
I think if we had a session in which the House DFL majority and the Senate Republican majority were the only players, we would have had a bonding bill and a tax bill. I think that Minority Leader Dowd's link of the bonding bill to ending the peacetime emergency, coupled with the governor's focus on managing that emergency, really led to a situation in which it was difficult for the two majority parties in the legislature to come to an agreement. I think Senator Gazelka is sincere in wanting a bonding bill. I certainly know that Speaker Hortman does. I'm not sure at this point in time whether Leader Dowd really wants a bonding bill or not, but he'll have a few weeks to help to figure that out. I think after 3 weeks, it begins to be a lot more difficult to put a deal together.
So I think everyone's always interested. I mean, the conversation we're having, is about what you do, which you have done in normal circumstances, and these are not those circumstances. How difficult is it with the pressure of the economic changes, the virus, not being able to interact with your colleagues face to face in the way that you normally would? I mean, what is leadership in this environment? What's that pressure like?
Well, I would say that the session itself, the lack of a critical mass of people at the Capitol and the sense of urgency and energy helped to contribute to the challenge of pulling a deal together. And it's just not the same if you don't have, a regularly scheduled set of meetings. And I think, I'd be curious about others' thoughts, but it really is a challenge to pull people together who don't naturally want to come together over technology like Zoom or on the phone. And it just takes a long time to do everything. So there was kind of the institutional, just people not used to working in that way that was difficult. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of the pressure cooker environment of the Capitol that helps drive parties towards a deal when they might not otherwise need one, and they might be, more willing to walk away. So I think that fueled it. Figuring out how to balance our obligations and responsibility to staff and members' safety, our obligation to serve the public and get work done on the public's behalf, and to make sure that we were doing that consistent with the Constitution and open meeting laws was something that we had to take on very quickly. And so in the House, we were able to shift all of our committee work to remote hearings. And we were able to transition the House floor into really a skeleton crew on the floor, with individuals being able to vote remotely and debate remotely. But it took much more time to do simple things in that constrained environment than it would normally. So figuring out how to re-engineer what we did was successful, but it was still a cumbersome process in the end, and almost a throwback to the way the legislature was before technology existed, when everything had to be read out, every roll call was oral, and just the volume of work that you could do was much less than it is now. There is all of that. Plus, there's a difference between people who quickly adapt to new circumstances, are comfortable with uncertainty, are willing to make decisions or take their best shot at a decision, not knowing kind of what the big picture is. And then there are people who are very comfortable down in the weeds, want to work on minutia. They want the environment to be set. They want their daily life to be known, and they don't want to think outside of that kind of framework. And you could really see, I think, in many ways, people separating themselves out that way.
So we've got a little data as things happen. So I think it's fascinating to look at the two different kinds of people. So with hindsight now, looking back to March or early April, are there decisions that you would make differently today, or think that the state would make differently today than we were making in March or early April?
I don't think that there are a lot of things that we should have done differently, at least as far as I can tell. I think providing financial resources and authority to state agencies and the executive branch to make decisions was important. I think that the governor largely acted consistent with the data he had available at the time. And frankly, I think public health data continues to support the approach that he has taken. I do think that, it was a difficult time to come through, and I don't know of any decisions really that should have been different from what the governor did or what the legislature did. I maybe wish the House of Representatives had been a little bit more quickly focused on some of the core issues in COVID-19, such as what is it testing and contact tracing really require, what kind of resources are necessary, how quickly can we learn lessons from public health professionals and apply them, and kind of dig into that a little bit more quickly. But I don't think it would have changed the outcome. I think it would have just helped us communicate more clearly as we went through that shutdown period.
Mm-hmm. So as from a policy perspective, what do we need to be doing now to be better prepared for that potential next wave or fall wave?
Well, I mean, we have a whole range of big picture questions. I mean, first of all, what happens with schools? And do we have a system in place where schools can partially have students come back or fully have students come back? What needs to change? Are we prepared for the election coming up in November? Did we provide the resources and flexibility that local units of government needed to conduct elections safely and successfully? Are we being honest with ourselves about PPE standards and whether nurses and frontline healthcare workers are actually being allowed to use that personal protective equipment in a way that protects their health according to scientific data, as opposed to according to, sort of scarcity standards of use. And so do we need to be thinking longer term about accumulating more of that? And then I think the big question really is, how willing are Minnesotans to comply with changing rules? And should we instead be focused on changing mindset in our daily lives, sort of in a classic public health campaign, against cigarette smoking or other kinds of things? Like, should we just be focused on certain personal behaviors that we want to encourage people to follow, as opposed to deciding at a macro level certain businesses can be open, or kind of the mechanics of that? So, all of that those are sort of big picture questions that we have to start grappling with. And, it's a real challenge for the political system to see if it can adapt. And then finally, I would say, if we do end up in that scenario, I think the scale of government response in the economy and for the economic security of individuals, families, and small businesses is going to have to scale up considerably at the state and federal level, or we are going to have a significant economic downturn for a long period of time, in my view. So
you mentioned the federal government, and always part of the equation. Do you think the federal government has done enough to help the states during this crisis? And are you hopeful that there will be more federal aid coming to Minnesota?
I think on an emergency basis, the federal government has been helpful, providing $2.2 billion altogether in Minnesota for aid to cities, counties, the state for COVID response has been very good and helpful. And it has really enabled us to make fast acting decisions, knowing that we're not just spending into a deficit in order to do. I think that time will tell a little bit about what the economic fallout of this is, whether it is as severe as it is now and long term, or whether it is something that corrects a little bit more quickly as people figure out how to adapt to the COVID threat in their daily lives. So that is an open question, but we are, I think, already at the point government is going to have to step up and provide more aid to states and units of government, or we are going to, or the layoffs and wage cuts that will be necessary in the years ahead are going to be a significant continued drag on the economy. And that isn't good for anybody either. So my sense is, from an economic standpoint, much more is needed from the federal government in the months ahead, absent extremely good news on the disease front.
So I know you're trying to get done the things that really matter. Ask you about what I think can be a little bit of a sticky issue, and I think providers, healthcare providers in particular, this is of interest, which is liability reform. So obviously a lot of people moving very quickly for all the right reasons to do all the right things. Wanted to get your sense of where you guys are at on liability reform, how you view it.
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, Minnesota has a pretty good system. We have relatively, I wouldn't, not low, but we have a pretty moderate medical liability system. The claims are not of the extreme size that you might see in other places. You have to have an expert provide an affidavit before you can even get to the point of bringing a claim. The standard, I believe, the standard of care includes the circumstances that the provider is operating in. And I think our legal system, the court system in Minnesota, is pretty sensible and grounded, in the sense that if claims start to be brought under COVID that are outrageous or are kind of beyond what is fair under the circumstances, I think Minnesota courts will address them in a reasonable manner. Overall, I think Minnesota's medical liability system is reasonable, and it will continue to be reasonable. And I'm not sure, absent some evidence that isn't the case in Minnesota, that we should start to mess with that system.
Yep. And by the way, I should have mentioned, Ryan, so we have folks throwing questions through the Q&A. So, except for the kickoff, most of these questions that I'm throwing at you are coming from our audience. But I'll ask a question from the Medical Alley perspective, and that is, as you know, healthcare is one of Minnesota's top industries, 500,000 Minnesotans. You are very familiar with it, having worked in this industry yourself. What can we be doing as an industry to be helpful? What do you want to see from our industries during this time and going forward?
Well, I mean, I would hope that you continue to operate your businesses successfully and keep employing Minnesotans and keep our economy as strong as it can be. And that, to the extent you need to make investments to, to innovate and find market space in a COVID-related world or COVID-related market segment, that you're able to do that and get access to capital and operate the way Minnesota companies do. And so, I'm not somebody who is looking for a silver bullet from a vaccine or some a treatment that is going to just take care of this problem. I think we have to be in this for the long run. And I think to the extent our businesses can keep people employed, can take a bit of a short-term hit while recognizing the long-term strength of the industry that they're in. I hope the industry will do that. And whether or not we come, I think people are going to adapt to the new COVID reality well before there is a vaccine or a meaningful treatment.
got a political question for you around fundraisers. One of our
Yes.
audience members. So, normally after session, caucuses have fundraisers, and clearly that's not going to happen in the way that it normally would. So what are your plans for caucus fundraisers, and what are you telling your candidates about campaigning during this season with the virus?
Sure. I mean, obviously fundraising continues, and we do have large events. I think we will continue to try to do sort of remote type events.
Mm-hmm.
I think we could theoretically do small group gatherings consistent with social distancing, and do some in-person fundraising. But a lot of it, I think, is going to be over the phone and kind of, Zoom type events where we can still have conversations, but it's just not the same. As far as a campaign goes, our foundational campaign technique is going door to door, canvassing door to door. And I'm skeptical that we're going to be doing that anytime this summer, based on what the curve looks like.
Mm-hmm.
This summer will be getting worse and worse and worse for COVID cases. And I don't think having strangers wandering up to your door and going to every house in the neighborhood and every house in the district is something a lot of people are going to be very open to. And even if some are, you're not going to know. So I think our door-to-door strategy is going to be replaced by more of a focus on phones, on network type organizing. So figuring out how to use people's social media networks to tap into their contacts and get their sort of endorsement or saying positive things about you to their social network are ways that we are trying to adapt and train our candidates to do things differently. And then, we do rely on digital ads, and in some districts, TV or radio ads and direct mail. But I think a greater focus on digital media, digital ads will be another big part of how we operate.
Yep. So a little bit on the lighter side. So you, like all of us, have been stuck mostly at home. So what's the one new habit that you've picked up, or the new hobby that you've picked up since being quarantined?
Well, I have always enjoyed kind of home improvement projects and finishing things off, and I think just more time spent around the house has resulted in better landscaping, more organized closets, a little bit better looking household in general. So being around the house has forced me to do things to make it look better instead of running all over the place. I will say that there are definite bright sides to this. I am spending a lot more time not running my kids around to hockey or lacrosse or soccer or baseball or whatever the sport might be. And they're spending more time just doing kid things outdoors instead of being in organized activities. And in many ways, it reminds me a little bit more of my childhood and how things used to be. And I think that's, for them, a positive. Obviously not worth the price, but there are positive elements in our lives that I think are worth appreciating even in the pandemic.
Yep. So, and with things starting to open up a little bit, so as we create more and more opportunities to do things here in Minnesota, so what are some of those things that you're looking forward to doing this summer?
Well, typically we would spend as much time as we could up north. I grew up in Bemidji, and my parents live up there and have a nice place on the lake that we love to go up and spend as much time as we can. But they're both in their 70s and cautious, and I think they would make us quarantine for 2 weeks before we went up to spend a long weekend. So we're not going to be doing that. We're going to be spending more time at home. And as things open up a little bit, I just look forward to seeing my friends and family in small group settings a little bit more and spending more time socializing, maybe around a fire pit, or just seeing each other and really appreciating that in a way that I don't think we have appreciated enough. And I'm hopeful that finally the sort of slow summer that I've always thought I would have might actually come to pass. I know that's not true, but right now I still have hopes that it could feel like a bit of a sleepy, slow summer.
Yeah. Um, well, again, we've got a large audience out there. I want to give you, and I know I want to be sensitive to your time, kind of give you the floor, whether it's to, poke some questions out at the folks who are online that can follow up with you, or kind of tie up any loose ends. And we really appreciate you being with us. So I'll let you have the floor for either questions or comments.
Sure. So, I would really enjoy or find it valuable if, whether it's through Shay or Bobby or whoever, to provide just kind of a read on what you see out there in your industry, how things are functioning in your business, and just to get a feel for things. I have found through various Zoom town halls that I've done this spring that it's really been eye-opening to get a better understanding of what's happening, for example, in the construction industry or with domestic violence issues. Talking to the nurses has led to a series of questions about PPE standards. It's really valuable for us to hear directly from you or through your organization what's happening in your industry, what things we should be aware of, how policy should be shaped, and kind of what your assumptions are about the health economy and the economy in general, because we have a bunch of assumptions and we read a lot of media, but oftentimes what you're seeing or hearing in your industry is a better indicator. One example of that is, I've spent time talking with multifamily housing owners, landlords, developers, and so forth, who essentially say that the housing economy is much stronger than people thought that it would be. People are finding ways to pay their bills, and their rent collections are better than they expected, but projects in 9 months are essentially dried up. So thinking ahead about 9 to 12 months from now, we need to focus, for example, on the bonding bill, because that does create a lot of construction activity, not right away, but in that 9 to 12 month time period. So to me, hearing that from the housing perspective and from the construction industry indicates that there should be a renewed focus on a bill like that. So to the extent that you can share information about what the horizon looks like for you and your business and what you're seeing and expecting, that would be really valuable if you could pass that along. And then, as I mentioned before, I think this is a time when Minnesota has the opportunity to show that a sensible state of hardworking people who generally care about each other can actually do a better job looking out for each other's public health, looking out for each other's economic well-being and financial security. And we are fortunate to have a business community in this state that shares those same values. And so I hope that regardless of the political rhetoric, regardless of the conflict that might arise in this election year in a pandemic, I am hoping that the kind of the best of our state, the best of our people shines through, and we don't succumb to that very conflict oriented, bruising national political scene that we're seeing in front of us, regardless of political party. I think we actually have to rise to this occasion, and we can do it in Minnesota, but it will not be easy. So to the extent that you can participate in that as a business person or in your personal life, I think we'll all be better off.
I think you can look forward to working with us on it. I think Minnesota, all of you as leaders, have done a really great job. I know the business community in particular, the healthcare community, is really appreciative of the leadership and the straightforwardness that by and large has been shown, again, by all of our Minnesota leaders. So first and foremost, want to say thank you from the Medical Alley community. Everyone participating again, happy to connect you directly with Leader Winkler, and obviously Ryan will reach out and chat through some of your specific questions, give you some good insights into what we're seeing and how some of the orders have had impacts, what we're seeing coming back. And so that's on us. We'll follow up immediately to have that chat with you. But I also want to encourage, again, everybody who's on this Zoom meeting to please follow up with us so we can get you connected to Ryan. And so again, Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time. You got a lot of stuff on your plate. Again, we are appreciative and thankful. Thanks for spending the time with us. And also don't hesitate to let this community know what we can continue to do besides creating all the solutions necessary to deal with this virus, do the testing and take care of people, but how we can work more and more with you in the House and other leaders to put Minnesota in the best position possible. So thank you for your time today. And to all of you again, thank you for attending this town hall. Go to our website or look for your newsletters to indicate our next town hall. We will continue to try and bring you both relevant content, but also leaders in Minnesota and in Washington are making decisions about the health and welfare of all of us. So thank you for your attendance. Ryan, one more time, thank you. Everybody have a great holiday weekend, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you for Medical Alley.